So I have 4 o'clock and I'd like to call the meeting to order. And just do quickly a roll call of all of us who are here so far. Ruth Lauer,
Aye, here.
Ann Rarick, myself, Claude,
Aye.
and Bruce Button. And Paul McCone Paul's coming on.
Do I have a Bruce? I don't see a Bruce.
I don't see a Bruce Button yet. But Paul is black and
I'm working on it. I am I'm a
Okay.
Zoom neophyte.
and I'd like to have any comments about the minutes. I don't know, Claude, you didn't send them out to everybody, did you?
No, I think I think it's decent policy, just to send it to the chairs,
Okay,
and then I guess we distribute, I could send them out now if anyone hasn't seen them.
The minutes should have been distributed with the agenda and posted.
I only saw the agenda on the calendar. And I wondered about that, whether or not I should resend the agenda and the minutes so that people would have it to refer to.
Well, it made it partway through the chain, but I guess it didn't get to the end. I'm sorry about that, Claude.
Okay, they're actually relatively brief, so I could almost read them. It might be faster than me just sending it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I'm okay, that's good.
Okay.
That's fine.
So I listed who was present, everyone on the board, and anybody else who checked into the Zoom. I listed, I don't think I missed anybody. Had the call to order by Susan Bates at 4:10, had an election of officers. After introductory remarks by Susan Bates, the board took the following actions. Ruth Lauer moved and Ann Rarick. Is that how I say it? Rarick?
Rarick.
Rarick, thank you. And Rarick, with a name like Cicchetti, I find that it's always good to have. And Rarick seconded the motion to elect Claude Cicchetti as clerk. The motion passed unanimously. Claude Cicchetti nominated and Paul McCone seconded the motion to elect Ruth Lauer and Ann Rarick as co-chairs. The motion passed unanimously. And then the largest section is discussion. And just so you get a sense of this, and I hope everyone works with this, but my sort of philosophy on minutes is that I do not attempt to make a transcript. I attempt to capture the quite important points, as well as clearly any votes, any decisions. The discussion. The board discussed the charge given to the group by the select board and the possible areas to consider in our deliberations, such as best practices in other towns and statutory grievance procedures. Ann Rarick suggested a strong focus on looking at best practices and asked what information on this might be available. Paul McCone suggested potential outreach to current employees, and others concurred and added potential outreach to citizens and other stakeholders as well. Susan Bates and others pointed toward data and analysis that is available on the town website that has been previously completed that we might find useful. Some of this was done in preparation for a town meeting warrant article that was not moved given the creation of this task force. The board discussed the possibility of bringing in those who had worked on this analysis to get their perspectives, as well as those of the human resource director and a representative of the current personnel board. No decisions were made on this except to consider this for future meetings. I then have a list of the future meeting schedule. The board agreed to the following schedule of future meetings through the end of the year: Monday, November 8th, Thursday, November 18th, Monday, November 29th, Thursday, December 9th, all at 4 p.m. And then adjournment. The meeting was adjourned at 5:15 p.m. I'm happy to talk in detail if somebody thinks I missed something or something could be clarified.
Well, for purposes of discussion, I move approval.
Second.
So any discussion further? I guess the only thing at this point is to ask for everybody's vote. All those in favor, please say, well, let's raise your hand. It's easier for me just to see your hand. Great, okay. And just to clarify in the future, Claude, sending the draft minutes to us all, I think probably makes the most sense.
Okay, I'm happy to do it however you want. I mean, I know some boards, it goes to the chair to make sure the chair is happy with it, and then it gets sent on. But if you wanted me to send it to everyone, it's your call. Happy to do it.
I don't know about you, Ruth, but I just feel like it's all of our meetings, so.
I'm happy however you want to do it, as long as,
Multiple pairs of eyes.
Okay, okay.
but
I'll do
I
that.
think we
I-
should agree that it will go out in the posting officially
Yeah,
to the town clerk, because the town clerk does not distribute draft minutes, but there are some people who need to see the draft minutes. For instance, the
yeah.
select board.
Susan had her hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that if everyone gets the minutes, you should just respond to one person, probably Claude as clerk, to edit all of or include all of the edits, and then resend it out. So there's no open meeting law, out of meeting deliberation going on.
Right, that means we have to be careful never to hit reply all,
Mhm.
because that's kind of an open meeting. Okay, good.
Unless you're talking about scheduling a meeting, and then that's not really deliberation, that's
Okay.
scheduling.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. Okay, let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about the webpage. And Ruth, you did something today on that.
Yes, I did. I worked with the public information officer named of Aaron Stevens, who posts things to the town website. Unfortunately, our first posting was subsumed into the personnel board. You had to go reach deep, but you can find it. She will correct that, because we are a freestanding group. She will make sure that our committee is posted as its own self. And it will contain the charge of the committee, or I'm sorry, the task force, the charge of the task force, the agenda and minutes as they are created, the and
Roster?
as she described it to me, when I send minutes and agenda to the town clerk, it will become part of a link that will send it in addition to our committee page. So that if someone is going to look for this, they can find it very quickly. Otherwise, minutes get posted not as often to the town website. And it sometimes is difficult to stay current. So they've developed this process, which I haven't seen in action, but I'm assuming it does. They will go to our webpage through a link with the town clerk. The other thing that we have to talk about for the webpage is often there is what I call a roster, what other people might say membership list of the committee, and contact information should you wish to provide it. Now, for some committees, let's say the select board, the contact information would be the assistant, the select board admin assistant, rather than the individual people on the board. Other committees have individual names and personal email addresses. Aaron often makes it possible to have a committee email address that will then go to different members. So we have to, amongst ourselves, decide, A, if we want a roster, at a minimum, at least the chair, the co-chairs should be there to make sure that we can stay in touch with our community, with our stakeholders. And then before I let that go to discussion, then we also have to have a provision for background documents that we decide should be there as part of our discussion. And then future, any documents that we create, such as interim reports and final reports.
Okay.
Okay, so back to, how do we want to handle roster?
I'll open the floor to the comments. How do you feel about it, Paul?
I don't have any problem with using my own email and putting that out there. I don't care. It's everywhere anyway. So as far as personal contact information or I'm open to anything. I don't have any, we put it another way, I don't have any concerns or restrictions that I would be concerned about. If people wanted to, I don't know how else we do it. Would you do it through the town server? I don't know how personal email affects the public records law. I understand how it is. Someone could request it and you'd be compelled to give it. And I'd be perfectly okay with that.
Yeah.
So
I
I think whatever you experienced folks come up with will be just fine.
Go ahead.
One,
Ruth.
thank you. One of the reasons to have the committee address is that all correspondence that we receive is a public record, and it would be collected there. The difficulty is that all correspondence would be a public record. And some of our stakeholders might want to speak one-on-one and not speak to.
Off the record, in other words.
Yeah, and then it would be our obligation to translate that into a message that is important for the committee to hear without names attached to it. So, each way we do it has some obligations for us. And I would agree with Paul, I'm not opposed to having my own email address out there. In this crazy world, sometimes you will get things from hither and yon that have nothing to do with the committee. And, that is a risk.
But that's a risk in having an email anyway.
True.
Claude? How about you?
Yeah, no problem at all. I don't know that there's an alternative, so that's fine with me.
All right, so what I'm hearing, if I may, is that we want both names and personally email addresses. I'm fine with that. How about you, Ruth?
I'm fine with it.
Yeah. So
do we need a vote or nods and twitches will do?
I just think everybody has spoken.
Okay.
I don't think it's a vote so much as you're going to do it.
All right, so I will convey that information to Erin Stevens as she is pulling together the pieces of the webpage.
Right. Great.
Oh, we will have to check in with Bruce.
Yeah.
I will do that.
Thank you. So member updates on any background reading. We did not assign any homework for anybody, but have you gotten into a groove yet? It's only been 2 weeks, but I did send something to Ruth this morning. I wondered whether or not it might be worth sharing with other people. It was very interesting. It's an article by McKinsey about new hiring practices, talking about the 21st century, how people are just not going to operate the way they did in industrial age recruiting.
Mm. And, I think it's worth sharing that, Ian, because not only is the recruit different, but the institution has to be different
Yeah.
to respond to those recruits.
And it was interesting, it was, obviously they're more interested in the business world, but it is clearly very much having to do with municipalities and nonprofits as well.
Mhm.
I will send it, go ahead, Paul.
I'm just jumping in line. I have read a couple of articles and I kept them on the same report that you're talking about, Ann. Very interesting.
Yeah.
So what you have, I think, was certainly germane to it. Looking over the documents that are on the town's website, and I touched on it last week, when the personnel board was first created at the same time as the assistant town manager became the HR director, and the personnel board was actually assembled, and that was changed. The very first item seemed to talk about, and I really like to, not lose sight of outreach to employees. That's the first thing they did.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that we're almost doing the same thing now. Is we may not be starting a personnel, talking about starting a personnel board, but I think we're in the beginning throes of recreating what could be different items for the people that are on the personnel board. And I actually think there's a lot of room for new things for the personnel board to do that tie into what Ann was just talking about, in new hiring and retaining employees and the whole new system. So I think it's kind of exciting, and I think there's a lot. I think there's a lot out there, and I really, sit in contact with the citizens, and especially, and I'll close with one thing that became me. I started part-time in 1978, got on full-time with the town in 1981. Anita Techley was the human resources person because she was the assistant town manager.
And watch out, she's listening.
That's okay. That's okay. And that was the beginning of the personnel board and all of that. I learned things about the personnel board and reading this I never knew in 31 years of working for the town.
Wow. Like
so
what?
I was a union, and I've been in the union, outside the union, as a supervisor, as the deputy police chief. I wasn't in the union. So I learned a lot of things just reading about it. I'm going to take a flying stab at the employees have no clue as to the grievance process. I know they don't call it grievance in the documents, but it's a appeal on decisions and things. So I think outreach is huge. I mean, I'm really stuck on that.
Okay. I'm actually going to kind of repeat what I said last week too. I'm really, really hesitant about outreach before we even define the problem. And having gone to the website and read some of the materials, I actually, came into this not knowing at all really what was behind this. So, again, my fault. I didn't follow the petition article, last time, at all. And I really wasn't even aware of what it was. So I come to this with absolutely not only no agenda, but no understanding of what the petition article is all about. And I was very surprised to see what it was, to see all the information and to see what they were looking to do, which, to my reading was basically to say, look, the personnel board, for lack of a better term, is a rubber stamp process for everything except grievance. So why not put things where they should be, which is with the town manager? And that's kind of a rough first reading of a lot of those things. And having been on the personnel board for 6 years, and I'm sure my colleagues, Susan and Nancy, who, who we served together, there's a lot on the personnel board that we really don't either have the background or understanding, or even really the standing to say. For example, the town manager will come with, different levels, and we can't say, are they too low, too high? Is that the right? The town manager has the ability to hire and does not have to come to the personnel board to ask that. So we're basically asked to approve something that we don't have the background or expertise to approve. And we basically have to rely on the town manager to say, do these levels make sense in your hiring? And the town manager says, yes, they do make sense in my hiring. And we say, well, nice job. So I think, the goal of of what my take on what we should be doing here is really, first, I'd love to hear from the people who put that information together, to kind of know what background is behind it. What are the nuances? What was the driving force? Why did they come up with the conclusions that they did? Because on the face of it, I find it pretty compelling. I can see that there is a role for some sort of, ombudsman type process, whether it's the personnel board or something else, where people have a defined grievance procedure. Now, the grievance procedure of the personnel board is very limited. Statutory, all we were ever meant to do is advise the town manager. It was never an appeal. But whether that should be changed, and I do think there is absolutely, Paul, I agree with you. I think there's absolutely a role for outreach, but I don't think we know anything near the parameters of the problem so that we could sensibly ask for, employee input. I think they would get the wrong idea, and it would give us the wrong idea of our process. I mean, we're not here to reinvent necessarily the personnel board. We're here to, define what the personnel board should be. Okay, and I'll stop there. Thanks.
I agree, Claude. I'm not suggesting our first step out the door here is employee outreach.
Yep.
I'm in that comment, and you made that comment last week, and I took it. Believe me, I took it. But I just think that is an important. I just wanted to reemphasize that at some level, at some point, some discussion with the employees is a big deal.
Yeah. The one thing I was going to ask you, Susan, was I saw something about the personnel committee meeting with the selectmen in a week or two. Or I guess it's next week. And is that a regular thing that they do on a quarterly basis, or what?
No, and if it's next week, there's a session coming up, and I'm not sure if it's next week or the week after, when we're talking about the long-range plan and getting input from
Yes.
everyone,
Yeah.
from all of the boards and committees. So my guess, not having, because the agenda hasn't been sent out for next week yet, that's the context that falls
Okay.
into.
Yes, it is. It says so
Okay.
in the calendar. Yeah.
Yeah. No, there isn't a periodic meeting between the personnel board and the select board, or with any of the committees the select board appoints on a regular basis. There are requests to, amend charges and to take specific actions, or just but that's on a kind of as needed basis. It's not a scheduled
But
thing.
you're specifically asking them what they're envisioning for 2030?
Well, the document in Concord Envision 2030 Envision, I can't remember the exact title of it, but it has very specific charts and actions in very specific areas. And for each committee where where the actions apply to them, then they would have a response, and it would be no action, in process, that's been tabled. So it's a response to a document, to that specific document.
So that may be worth us taking a look at as well, in terms of being kind of connected to the planning, the personnel committee, and being aware that those conversations are going on.
I don't, offhand, I'm not at home, so I don't have my source documents around me, but I can't recall what the specific areas are that would concern the personnel board. And I'm not
Right,
sure
right.
that you should put anything on hold in waiting to hear about that, because I think that's not necessarily, you can go ahead without considering that until it happens, and then, it's next week, so then
But it's always a dance when you've got multiple crossover conversations going on and planning's going.
Yes.
Yes, Ruth.
I'm sort of tripping over my ideas here, and I'm very sorry, but it's common with me. Paul and Claude have mentioned outreach from different points of view, and that brings to mind our goals. And definitely this should be in our goals statement as something in process. I also think as part of our goals that I would build on something that Claude said about how did we get here? Where did this come from? I think I need a better understanding from perhaps the petitioners, perhaps the work that Ellen Quackenbush did. I need to know, how did we get to this point to help me better see my way out the other end? And I guess that just brings me back to the notion of goal statement.
Yeah. Now, are you saying that this is the meeting we ought to do that at? We haven't put that specifically on the agenda, so.
But I think it has to be something that goes on our agenda,
Yeah.
because we need to do some heavy thinking on, once we know where we are, then we need to know where are we going from here.
So clearly that's the agenda item for the future.
Maybe many futures.
Yeah, I do like the idea of hearing from Ellen Quackenbush in particular, because she seems to have done an awful lot of research. And, out of respect for that research and her position, I think we certainly owe her a pretty good hearing on this. And I agree with what Ruth said. You can't decide where to go unless you know where you are. And quite frankly, it was really informative to read some of those things, but I'd love to really hear from her and others as well.
Susan, did you have your hand up?
I did. I just wanted to add that it might also be helpful to speak to the HR director, Amy Foley, about the history of how we came to be here.
Yeah.
May I just throw in a question for the board,
Yeah.
for the group? Yeah, since you had mentioned Amy, any thoughts on I have a sort of a small short list of information I'd like to get from, I believe, the personnel or human resources might be the person to answer the questions. I'm inquiring as to the chairs, what would be the best process? How is this done when you start asking town staff questions as part of the board, as part of the committee?
Ruth,
I think, first of all, the whole group of us individually can't go trolling. We have to make decisions as a group, what is needed, and then somebody gets to volunteer to go look for it. And so say it's Paul who we asked to find out certain pieces of information. So he is going to go looking for that, and he's going to come back in some cases with data, in some cases with anecdotes. For our purposes, I think data is better than anecdote.
That's what I'm looking for, Ruth, just so you, I'm looking for data. So,
So, I think if you have a good list of what you think is needed, tell us so we can say yay verily.
certainly, I mean, I think I'm in more agreement with Claude than he may think I am with just trying to get a handle on, what we're doing.
Yeah.
And
So what kinds of things are you looking for?
in the reading of the documents that were on the town website and some questions that have been recently posed, since it has to do with employment and turnover for the last 7 years, and I picked 7 years arbitrarily out of thin air because that's generally the record retention law.
So you're looking for data on turnover?
Yes,
Okay,
turnover over the last 7 years, meaning, how many people have left and how many people have been rehired. I saw a comment had been made by someone, and I don't recall who it was, in one of the meetings, say that there were X amount of people that have left and X amount of people were hired. So I think to get some handle on, I haven't been involved with the town for 11 years, that would be helpful. Added positions in the last 7 years, that the personnel board knows how many new positions have been created, and human resources would, and just the raw numbers of current employees. It would be helpful to me to have some sort of data where you can have an analysis of how many more people are we talking about. I happen to think, and this could be completely off the charts, that when I started with the town, it was around 200 employees. And I could be wrong.
500 now, aren't we?
And I believe someone had mentioned in the last meeting that we're around maybe 400. So we've doubled the number of employees. So I think that widens the scope of the whole process here. So those are just basic numbers that I'd be looking for, and I think would be helpful to all of us.
If I think it's a good idea. It would be nice to know the sort of scope and scale of the issue, but I think we should separate kind of, there seem to be a couple of different types of questions. One question is, why are we here? What are the correct questions surrounding the role of the personnel board? Is it the right role? Is it a problem that they're being rubber stamped? Would it be better helped elsewhere? And a lot of people have done research on that, and Amy Foley can definitely talk to it as well. So I'd actually love for all of us to hear from Ellen and Amy, and I think it would be wonderful if they had the time to come to one of our meetings. Schedule it one week, another week, and perhaps half an hour. And if it goes longer and they have the time, great. So I think that'll give us a lot of information. Kind of another level would be, some of the things that we would get to when we knew things about turnover. The thing that worries me a tiny bit about turnover is we're talking about potentially evaluating the appropriateness and the job of the HR department and of the town manager. And I'm not sure that's the task of this committee, to evaluate whether we have too much turnover, too little turnover, whether we've expanded too much. I don't know that that's what this committee is meant to do. My take on this committee is we're meant to ask the questions of ultimately what should the personnel board do? And then it would be up to the person. If we thought the personnel board would be a good place to evaluate the HR department, that's great. But I don't think we should even come close to evaluating the HR department. I just think
that's not, believe me, that's not what I'm suggesting.
Yeah.
What I'm suggesting is just raw data.
Yep. And I get it. You get the scope and scale. But, again, the information that Ellen and, the HR director have is about the role of the personnel board. And I'd love for us to focus on that, because that really seems to be our mission. But I agree, it's good to know the scope of it. And whether it's 200 or 2,000 is a big question. I totally agree.
Well, and I think there's also just where are we philosophically about what kind of a town employer do we want to be?
Yeah,
That's more the philosophical.
yeah,
And it gets back to, I think, Claude, what you were saying, which is, that's kind of the thing that the personnel committee ought to be a part of.
I agree.
right.
I agree.
Any other thoughts? I would like, Ruth and I will probably get together and debrief afterwards and talk about probably reaching out to Amy and to Ellen, since this is something you've both expressed interest in, and see if they could make our next meeting or one of the next meetings, and we'll try and get that on the agenda. Is there anything other than that specifically that we can do to forward our, go ahead, Ruth.
I don't know that it has to be in any particular order, but I think I'd like to hear from the petitioners of the articles.
Okay.
Who were the petitioners?
Well, the former employees. Oh, Susan has names. Sorry.
Well, it was Ned Perry and a group of private citizens is how it was worded. Ned Perry was the lead petitioner.
Everybody knows who Ned is?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, there's Mark.
Mark, were you part of the petition?
I want to really be clear about this, because this is an area of ongoing confusion. In the 2020 town meeting, an article number 6 was put on the town warrant by the personnel board at the urging of the HR director to essentially completely replace the town's personnel bylaw. It was brought forward at a public hearing, as all articles for a regular town meeting are. And at that point, I and several other citizens reacted to the content of that article as essentially pushing aside any substantive role for the personnel board, basically permanently. In the interest of streamlining town meeting for 2020, that was one of the articles that was set aside due to the pandemic that we were all experiencing. And at the time, I and others went to the personnel board and said, we think this article is at the very least incomplete, because it proposes taking the personnel board and changing it into a purely advisory body with virtually no responsibilities as outlined in the bylaw. And we think more work should be done on that. And we did that at the hearing and repeatedly throughout the year. So along comes the 2021 town warrant. And again, at the personnel board, the virtually identical article was proposed. There were a number of meetings in which that article was discussed, and some changes were attempted, but really no work was done on it. And so the proponents of the article that was put on the town meeting warrants in both cases, to my view, were both the personnel board, who was the officially recommending it, and to a large extent, town staff in the form of the HR director and town manager, who were proposing specific changes, i.e. complete replacement of the town bylaw. It was in response to that insufficient proposal that I and several others, including Ned Perry and Anita Techley, came up with what we thought were alternative, at least the recommendation that article should not be moved and that some real work should be done on exactly what the bylaw should say. At this stage of the game, I believe everybody in the committee has now taken a look at both the bylaw and the 1985 document, which isn't quite a charge, but it's the closest thing that we have, and it recognizes at the very least they're not particularly up to date. And beyond that, there are considerable other, there are portions of them that are simply appear to have been set aside over time and no longer followed. And so the recommendation of this citizens group was primarily to go back and take a look at those two documents, the bylaw and the 1985 document, and turn them into a legitimate charge to a board that represents a clear definition of what its role should be in governance. And I have some opinions on what some of those goals might be, but I really want to be clear. The article at town meeting was proposed by staff, essentially, put on the warrant by the personnel board, objected to by citizens, and at that point we did at least draft a potential amendment that we would have proposed had the select board not agreed to simply, take another look at it and appoint your task force to begin to study it. So that, I believe, is the accurate history. If anyone doesn't agree with that, I would suggest, but it's very important to realize that this was not simply proposed at town meeting. This was a reaction to a proposal that came from staff.
Mark, just a question.
Sure.
You mentioned, the reaction to the warrant article. Do you have any document you could point to us or share with us that kind of sets out your objection to the warrant article?
Sure. I made statements at both public hearings and I have those written up, and I'd be happy to share them with the committee. So if you'd like, I'll do that. And as I mentioned, I think at the last meeting, but I also made numerous comments that are also included in the minutes of personnel board meetings since then that reflect, on various aspects of this. But of course, I would be happy to.
Okay. And do you think, hard perhaps to say, but you seem to be suggesting there's a group of citizens that it sounded organized in a sense. Would those views of yours be reasonably consistent with everyone, or should there be further outreach to other people in that group? If so, who? I mean, I think everyone on this committee, given our charge, wants to have as much information as possible from all directions. So, what do you think the best way to get that is?
Well, I'll just respond that, obviously I have my own personal views, and I would say that for the various people that I spoke with, who I think are mostly perfectly capable of speaking for themselves and are aware of this process, the thing in common that we had was that the personnel board needed direction. It needed to be in dialogue with the select board about how it was supposed to be discharging its duties and exactly what its duties were. And then, what exact form that takes beyond that, I think is a place where, many people may have different opinions, and I certainly have mine and wouldn't pretend that they represent some organized group.
Susan?
Yeah, thank you. I agree with a lot of what Mark said, but I just want to be clear that the personnel board has struggled with what its role is for many, many years. It's not a recent thing. Didn't happen when we got a new town manager. We've been talking about it for years. So I would just like to say that the article that was put forward was very much a personnel board initiative. It wasn't a staff initiative. And it was from just what comments that Claude has made before about how we didn't feel like we had the expertise and and what purpose were we serving in the current role. So I just objected to the characterization that it was staff driven. Any committee that puts together warrant articles has staff input and help, but this was absolutely a personnel board initiative. And it was discussed, if you go back and look at the meetings, there were 3 successive meetings that this was voted 3-1 to proceed with the article. Next month, same discussion, 3-1 proceed with the article. So there was a lot of discussion, and in the end, the decision was made by the select board to appoint this task force. But it's this has been a long time coming. I mean, this when you look at, if you look at the bylaw as a personnel board member, you go, well, we don't do this, we don't do this, we don't do this, we don't do this. So what should we be doing? That's the crux of the question, as far as I understand it.
Thank you. Anita?
There was concern, and I was on this informal committee. There was concern that the cart was put before the horse, in that the proposal that was made by the personnel board for 2 successive years was to eliminate the bylaw without going through that exercise of what, if anything, should the personnel board be doing. And the arguments that were made by the personnel board, but primarily by staff, was, well, we'll try it. And because it was the proposal was to put all oversight, all salaries, job descriptions, employee benefits, all in the discretion of the HR director and the town manager, with no requirement that they report to anyone, and no oversight. It would not be coming to town meeting, and there was no requirement they even report what they do to the personnel board. And we had concerns about the process. At no point in the 2 years leading up to this, although Susan, I'll take your word for it that the personnel board discussed it. But I went through 2 years worth of minutes. At no point were employees even discussed that we should consult them. They were not brought into the process. The arguments made at the public hearing for the 2020 town meeting were ignored. No discussion between 2020 and 2021. Virtually the same article was brought back to 21, and any comments that were made by, at least there were 3 of us who spoke, maybe more, Mark, you might remember, but I can recall off the top of my head at least 3 people who spoke. And I'd be happy, I have my written comments. I would be happy to share with the committee comments from this year. I think I spoke a little more extemporaneously the prior year, but I do have them in writing for this year. Claude, I'd be happy to share those with you. But I would say, speaking for myself, there were concerns about the process, and it was moved too quickly, and the impression that the employee input was neither welcomed nor needed. And I think that was, and the personnel board is the only group that non-union people can go to if they're not pleased with their salary or benefits. And that had not been used for years, because it wasn't, they were not an inviting group, and it was not made clear that that was an option for employees. And I think that was unfortunate.
Do any of you have questions of Mark or Anita or Susan?
I don't think it's a question, but that was something that jumped out at me when I was going over these documents. This goes back to what things I've learned and didn't know, is that the personnel board, by its current existence, has a potential role in, and I'm using the word grievance, it's not used, but if an employee has a grievance, it doesn't have to be benefits or according to the current law, that they can appeal it or grieve it through the personnel board. And I completely understand that it's an advisory role and that it's a strong town manager form of government, and the town manager makes the final decision on things. However, in my 30 years, I never knew that process even existed. And how that works, I think, I'm not sure how it works. It just, the charge or the bylaws speak to or say that an employee simply jumps in and makes an appeal to the personnel board. Well, I know from other grievance processes, and this is a personnel board. It's in the bylaws. Is there a formal process for grievance if an employee wants to make use of the personnel board? Is there a grievance form?
Yeah, my understanding is that there is, but to give you a sense, I was on the personnel board for 6 years and never once did we ever have such a meeting. If there was a grievance, my understanding was it generally involved lawyers, and the lawyers involved didn't come to the personnel board because while it may be statutory, it was purely advisory to the town manager and wasn't necessarily in the employee's interest. Now, I don't know how it was communicated to employees. I don't know if it's in their contract. I don't know if it's in some general forum, but I would assume that their ability to go to, and I hesitate to use the word appeal because it certainly is not an appeal. It's just the ability to have a town employee have some citizens who happen to be personnel board members hear them. And I think given legal issues surrounding HR and how careful one would have to be, and given that nobody on the personnel board, unless they have it from their personal life, has specific HR training, I certainly don't. I don't know, to what extent we ever could even really, respond in a sensible way, except to be sympathetic. And again, I'm not sure how useful that role is. Now, whether that's the right role, whether there should be a better role, it kind of talks to what Susan and I think other people that have sat on the personnel board, part of our frustration. The core responsibility of the personnel board is certainly not financial. You get these bands of employment that the town manager says, these are what we need. And it's not that the town manager is asking for money. The personnel board is not the finance committee. It's not the select board. We can't appropriate money. We can't even comment on it. So, we're continually asked, members of the personnel board are continually asked to be involved in things over which we really can have no responsibility. And I think the grievance process is part of that. I mean, should it have been advertised more? Maybe, but then again, maybe not. Maybe it isn't the right grievance process. Should there be a grievance process? Of course, but I'm not sure the previous one ever worked particularly well for anybody.
Ruth, did you have your hand up?
Well, I think if I build on what Claude is saying, then he's more or less responding to Mark and Anita's point that there are things in the current job description, if you wish, that need to be refreshed, not necessarily eliminated, but approached from a different way. And, in my opinion, better to do this through a committee study than throw it out.
I agree. Because it exists now. I've never, in 30 years of working for the town, I never heard of it. Never knew anybody that took process, and I understand Claude's point completely with respect to employment laws and confidentiality, but the ultimate, it's in the bylaws that the employee can choose whether the personnel board hears a grievance in an executive session or in an open session. I think any use of the personnel board in this sense, we should look at, it's driven by the employee and not driven by you have to do this, or it's written in a bylaw to file a grievance or vent or whatever you want to call it. That's employee driven. It's not going to be a part of the process, and it's employee driven. I mean, I can think of no other, I really honestly can't think of any serious problems with an employee signing a waiver that says, I want the personnel board to hear my point and render an opinion. Now, whether or not the town manager takes it or anybody understand, factors into their decision, that's up to them. We have a strong town manager government. The town manager can say, I don't care what anybody says. I'm making this decision. He can. He legally can. This all ties in with my thoughts on this is a process that currently exists. I don't think anybody understands how it would exist. But we should talk to the employees and amongst ourselves at some level and see if it's something they're interested in.
Susan?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, there were 2 such cases in 9 years that I was on personnel board, and I only have clear memories of one, and it was appealing a wrongful dismissal. And our charge was to hear it and make a recommendation to the town manager, either supporting what he did or not. But it was a lawyer process. It was a legal process. I mean, the employee had their lawyers, our counsel was there, and we listened to both sides and made a recommendation to the town manager. But at the time I was thinking, that we didn't know the legal ramifications of well, we really carried no weight. We would make a recommendation to the town manager, but the questions that were being asked of us by the employee's lawyer were unusual and not particularly on target. So it ended up, I think there was some sort of settlement. I know there've been a lot of employees who've left since then, and we don't hear about that. The personnel board does not hear about that on a regular basis. This was a very unusual. There are two cases where that came to light. But again, as Claude said, were we the people to hear that? We were listening to the town manager's case and the employee's case, and that was the extent of it. But it had already progressed. If the lawyers were all in the mix, it had progressed past where it was going to be if we ever had any say that there would be some power or weight to our decision.
Yeah, thank you. Claude? Did you?
Oh, no, I just unmuted.
Oh, okay. I saw you unmute. Okay, Anita.
In the not so distant past, although it sounds like it was perhaps before Claude or Susan served on the personnel board, the personnel board initiated meetings each year with non-union employees in smaller groups. And this took place over the course of a couple of months. They would meet during working hours for the most part. And with the idea of giving the employees a heads up about what the annual cost of living increase was going to be, giving them a heads up about before it came to town meeting about any proposed changes to employee benefits, and then hearing concerns raised by employees. And out of those meetings, sometimes they would hear some issues about working conditions that were being ignored by at the department head level. And I don't disagree. Technically, these should have been handled by staff or department heads or the town manager, and that didn't always happen. So the personnel board sometimes served as mediators in informal way. The employees are entitled to get a bathroom break when they're out in the field, and that was sort of more of an issue when they started adding females out in the crews. The guys could just go in the woods. Well, females couldn't. And or when it's 100 degrees, provide more water, then we don't get enough water to drink when we're out working outside in the hot weather. It was things like that that would come up, and the employees, again, were not, they didn't have to wait till town meeting to find out what was, or until the warrant was printed, what was going to be proposed for their raises for the year. It was part courtesy, part just an amenable process. And that has changed. I don't know when it changed, but with the current administration and a bit under Chris Whalen as well, those meetings with the personnel board were eliminated, sometimes morphed into larger meetings with employees, with the town manager, and then it was morphed into just the department heads would give a report to all the employees. And they're really, so you're sitting in a room with 50 people, 75 people, which was an appropriate opportunity for employees to say, by the way, I don't get a bathroom break, but that you could do that when it was a smaller group. And so that whole process has evolved. So to say that there, and then there were more things like, grievance, someone really felt that they were being underpaid, or, the classification was in question and they weren't getting the response that they wanted from HR or the town manager's office. And so it was an opportunity for the personnel board to hear that. And again, the actual charge for your committee, which was done in 85, I guess. And I actually, I had a hand in drafting that, because when I worked for the town up until 85, and I was replaced with, there was a new personnel director and a department coming in, and the assistant town manager position was changed. And so I helped to draft that committee charge, and it wasn't just for the committee, it talked about the whole department. But that hasn't been looked at, obviously, for now I guess it's going on 35 years, and clearly that's over. Portions that have been ignored, but many portions are no longer relevant, and it needs to be updated. But to say there is no charge is just isn't true. There is a charge, and it needs to be changed. But there have been roles, more significant roles, those are perhaps no longer needed. But to totally eliminate it without the input of employees, I think is unfair to the people who are directly affected.
Oh,
Um,
and
just
then
to-
Mark.
Just to come back very briefly to this, the grievance aspect of this, the notes or the minutes from a FinCom hearing on March 10th of 2020. In this discussion, Amy states that the grievance process has 5 steps. The employee appeals to supervisor, the department head, the town manager, the personnel board for an advisory opinion, and the town manager for a final decision. So I'm not getting stuck on this. I'm just saying it's part of what the HR department is saying now. That's the role of the personnel board, or one of the roles now. And I think that whole thing needs to be redefined, to use Anita's word.
Yeah.
As far as I know, the employees have no idea this is even there, unless they're going to be shown the door and they know their right to a hearing. I think there's a lot of work to be done here, but I don't think it's insurmountable or necessarily is going to cross legal lines that we don't want to go. I think it should be a serious part of our analysis.
Thank you. Mark?
Thank you. I really liked where you started tonight when you referenced an article by McKinsey and Company around the future of the workforce, and also referenced the Envision Concord 2030 documents, which are about the strategic direction that we want to go as a community. We need to understand that we're a self-governing community of citizens, and we get to define how our local municipal government works. And that includes what sort of employer that government is, what that entity is. And I think that the personnel subject domain is as unique as the financial domain or the technology domain. And there are important reasons why the select board should be getting advised on it. We have a whole committee for zoning and planning that determines, and its purview is land use and how the land in the community is used. And it seems to me that the overarching goal of a personnel board should be to really pay attention on behalf of the citizens to what is the employment environment and what does it mean to work for the town? What are we looking for? What do we need as an employer, and be involved in the governance of that. We've seen that the workplace is changing. In the pandemic, we suddenly asked a workforce who was never even allowed, in fact, forbidden to work at home, to all go home and work. All of a sudden. And many organizations did this. And yet, and fortunately, people were flexible and did things, but we don't even know how well that worked out. And I think as citizens, we send an important message to our employees about who we are as a community when we endeavor to ask questions and understand what's going on in that. The appeal process is a very challenging issue. It's difficult and it's a bit of a red herring, because I think that we run the risk when we focus too much on that necessarily, or by its very nature, somewhat adversarial environment, those events around that, we run the big risk of losing track of the bigger picture, which is we want to know how to be a good employer. We want to know how to get the best talent we possibly can, develop them and retain them. And those are some of the elements that I think would be beneficial if they were really actually defined in terms of the charter that the personnel board actually does. And so I'm really hoping that this is a positive effort towards something along those lines. And I'm hoping you guys will look at that.
Thank you. Okay, so are there
Could I just jump in there? Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ann. I really, again, I don't think we should presume that we have the answers as to what these functions are and where they should go. For example, let's say we really like the idea of having an open grievance procedure. That does not mean that it necessarily needs to reside with the personnel board. It may better reside somewhere else. Somebody in the town manager's office, somewhere in the HR department, and we should not presume that we are here tasked to fix everything and put all those responsibilities in the personnel board. For example, somebody brought this up, and from having in my employer, I can't tell you how many hours of training we get in order to deal with issues of sexual harassment, of diversity, of violence in the home or the workplace, and how to react. And I just don't know, it actually terrifies me. And I don't think if anybody really understood the staffing, if, for example, we start to visit departments in small groups and get lots of feedback on all these problems in the workplace, what if we mishandle that? There are legal ramifications for us being told something and not handling it correctly. I do not know right now, with what I know, I'm terrified at the personnel board getting responsibilities for which they're not qualified for. We have HR people, and maybe there needs to be some distance, maybe there needs to be an ombudsperson, and I don't think any of us know how it should be fixed clearly. And I think we all get the sense that things need to be fixed, but I don't think we should presume that all those new responsibilities should go to the personnel board. They may better sit somewhere else.
Are there any other people who have not spoken that want to speak? Okay. All right. I think we have quite a few open-ended questions, comments, thoughts about inviting people that Ruth and I need to sort through. There were specific requests for some data, and I've got on an action item, which is to send out the article that I sent out to Ruth. And Mark and Anita, if there are comments that you would like to share with the committee, send them to me and I'll send them out to the rest of the group.
Perfect.
Is there any other action items that anybody else wants to volunteer to take?
Could we just reaffirm the future meeting schedule so that we have it in these
Yes.
minutes as well?
They are November 18th.
Yep.
November 29th, I am a little bit dubious about. I'm going to be in a car driving back from Virginia. That is the Monday after Thanksgiving. I'm just going to just put it out there. And December 9th.
Okay, good.
And those are all at 4 p.m. and they're all virtual.
And just so I know, who is Mac 1? Is that Bruce?
Yes, that's Bruce,
Okay, awesome.
Okay.
I think.
Bruce, do you want to say anything, even though we can't see you?
That's
Yeah,
not
yeah.
Bruce.
It's not Bruce.
Okay.
Oh, it's back. Okay, got it. Sorry about that.
All right, thank you very much.
I move to adjourn at 5:12.
And all those in favor, please raise your hand. I see everybody has raised their hand. Okay,
All
thank you
right.
very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Mark and Anita. That was really helpful.
Hope to see you all again. Okay.